Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Writers and Books Meet the BOA Author Series. I'm Chris Fanning. I'm the Director of Communications, Operations, and Special Events here at Writers and Books. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with us, Writers and Books is a nonprofit literary center in Rochester, New York. We offer readings, workshops, bookstore, literary programming for people of all ages and all backgrounds. You can find out more information about us on our website. That's WAB.org. And let us know that you're here. People are still coming into the chat. So go ahead and say hi in the chat function. And feel free to submit questions through the chat or the Q&A function. Peter will be monitoring that as well. Books are available for sale through our bookstore, Ampersand Books. I'll be putting the link to that in the chat as well. So keep an eye out for that. Writers and Books would like to call attention to the complex and troubled history of the lands on which we live and work. We are hosting this event from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Onondaga, or people of the Great Hill. In English, they were known as the Seneca people, or the Keeper of the Western Door. We're so happy to have George Looney with us tonight. First, we'll hear him read, and as I said, then he'll be joined in conversation with author and poet Peter Connors, who's the publisher and executive director at BOA Editions. Dripping with Southern Gothic flavors, the visibility of things long submerged gazes at the holy and the obscene while plumbing gritty secrets of the human heart. George Looney is the author of 3 previous award-winning fiction collections, a novella, Hymn of Ash, a novel, Report from a Place of Burning, and a story collection, The Worst May Be Over, as well as 13 collections of poetry, several of which have won national awards. He edited the forthcoming posthumous book, The Ceremony of Opening the Mouth, The Poetry and Prose of Douglas Smith. He is Distinguished Professor of English and Creative Writing at Penn State Erie, where he founded a BFA in Creative Writing program, where he is the editor of the international literary journal, Lake Effect. Welcome, George.
Thank you. Should I begin now?
You can go. It's your show now.
All right. Good evening. The story that I'm going to read tonight is actually the 5th story in a collection of 9 stories, so it's literally the middle collection. And there's just a couple of things I'll mention before I read the story to you. The speaker of this story is also one of the 3 narrators of the first story in the collection. And this story, in fact, references some events that occur in that story. The stories in this collection are all related. And I just wanted to mention, too, that there are some things in this story, places in particular, that are real. Subligna, Georgia, is a real place. The bar that is mentioned in the story, Marlowe's, is actually a real bar. Although I recently learned it's actually technically in Tryon, Georgia, which Subligna is kind of a part of. So those things are real. Lake Conesaga is also real, that's mentioned in the story, as is the Chattahoochee National Park. And scarlet snakes are actually a real snake. Everything else in the story is imagined. Okay, so the title of this story is A Very Old Music. First time I saw Carl, he was on his riding mower. And at first, I thought he must have his daughter on his lap. Folks around here often do that. Keeps the little imps entertained, or at least distracted for a spell. If I hadn't had the time to get a better look, that's what I'd have gone away thinking. Just a father keeping his daughter from getting cranky before dinner. But I was walking slow that day, weighted down with burdens no one looking might readily see any sign of. So I was close enough, long enough, to see, as the sun angled just so through the trees lining the lawn, the truth of it. That here was a man out mowing his lawn who had a second head on his shoulders. A woman's head at that. And though I could see she was saying something in his left ear, it would be a while before I heard her speak, and learned she only spoke Greek, and not modern Greek, but the Greek of Homer, of the Old Testament, a Greek of mystery and faith and everything that goes unwitnessed in this fallen world. A Greek few folks can understand even in Greece itself. Carl had no idea at all what she was saying, but she was almost always saying something in that sore left ear of his. No wonder the man seemed to have a permanent lean to the right. God sure does like to keep things entertaining. I mean, after all I've witnessed in this world, just to walk down an unassuming street can bring me face to face with another enigma, more proof that the miraculous and the tragic are as much a part of this desperate world as the mundane. If a man with a woman's head on his shoulder talking Greek in his left ear isn't sign of God's hand in all this, I don't know what is. It wasn't Carl's feminine tormentor that brought me to this little town in the middle of nowhere, but the pine woods that make up parts of the Chattahoochee National Park. Pine woods being the best places to find scarlet snakes. Leastways, that's what my reading up on them told me. And Subligna, what folks here call this ramshackle version of a town, sounded like Latin to me, like it was the name of something holy and mysterious. Like faith had to be strong in a place with a name like Subligna. Faith has always been strong in me, but like a scarlet snake, it has burrowed down into the sandy loam that must be all that remains of my soul. And it only comes out some nights to remind itself of the world it burrowed down to get away from, to convince itself that to stay hidden is best. My preaching days are over. Can't get up in front of folks and convince them to love God with your own faith burrowed deep within you and fearful of showing itself in the light. Sometimes, having a whiskey and Marlowe's, I stare at Gloria and her waitress get-up, looking so much in the dim light of that tavern like Rachel. It damn near has me ready to go deep into the Chattahoochee Park to hunt for a gator to feed myself to. But no gator can swallow me enough to cleanse me of my sins, or consume the ghost of the woman who haunts me with her body and her music and that perfect face I held in my hands and kissed one last time in the midst of a gator's guts and the shouting and cries from the congregation. Only the snakes hold out hope for me. If I can hunt down the scarlet snake whose markings spell out the depths of my sins, I can cut off its head and carve it and cook it up with some onions and peppers. And once I've eaten that snake, maybe then I'll be able to forgive myself. I'll know that snake when I find it. I'll be able to read my sins in the bands that cross its legless body. This, I believe. It takes a lot of faith to keep going in this world. Carl can attest to that. We drink together, Carl and me. The woman's head, growing from his left shoulder, only drinks ouzo. I've seen her knock back over a dozen shots of the licorice tasting stuff at a sitting. One night not long ago, after the 7th or 8th shot of ouzo, she started singing what must have been some ancient sea chanty. It could have been what that fellow Odysseus heard the sirens sing, him bound to the mast and calling out to his crew to let him go. Their ears stopped up with wax. They couldn't hear him or the sirens. His own plan. That must have been the worst of his torment, that he had willingly participated in what would deny him his chance to have such incredible longing fulfilled. His body become nothing but desire lashed to the mast. It must have seemed absolute cruelty how his crew ignored his transformation in their midst, from a creature of skin and blood and the passing of time to pure emptiness crying out to be filled. The voice the woman's head sang the untranslatable song in was so lovely, everyone in Marlowe stopped what they were doing to listen. Not one of us had any idea what words she was singing, but we all knew how it made us feel. Me, all I could do was think of Rachel playing the organ, how those hands of hers could turn the notes of any hymn into a promise of consolation and repair, of the mystical healing only possible with touch. That woman's head was busy seducing every man and woman within earshot. I don't know what kept me from grabbing Carl and kissing the lips through which that singing poured. After all, I've already kissed the bodiless head of a woman spilled out of a gator's opened gut. So kissing that singing woman's head on Carl's left shoulder wouldn't have felt so strange at all. Guess the mixing of the music and the whiskey just made it so I couldn't move. Mesmerized is the word for it. Most of us in Marlowe's were mesmerized. That such music stirs up rawer passions don't surprise me none either. One man that night in Marlowe's got up on the bar and took out his member and tried to put it in the mouth that music was coming from. Thank the Lord for Russell, the bouncer, who knocked the drunk off the bar and dragged him to the door and out into the street. Russ left him there crumpled in a heap of bawling flesh. Of course, it's not like some of the rest of us hadn't had the same thought. That music made those lips a promise of such pleasure, it was remarkable more of us weren't thrown out that night. Other nights, and tonight's one of those, the ouzo makes the Greek-speaking woman's head go quiet. Carl gets this smile on his face when this happens, and has been known to buy a round for everyone in the place. Not tonight, though. Tonight, he just smiles and sips his whiskey and sneaks looks at that quiet face. He's told me on nights when the ouzo quiets her, he can turn and gaze at her alcohol-becalmed face and almost feel a kind of love for her. He's told me once or twice when she's gone quiet after enough ouzo, he's almost kissed her himself. After Carl told me that, I started having dreams of being back on that stage, wallowing in the filth that spilled out of the sliced open gator, with Rachel's perfect face in my hands. And then I'm sewing her head onto my left shoulder, or in some versions, having someone else sew her head on my shoulder. And she is with me, and I'm kissing her, and the things her tongue does in my mouth are a miracle. Sometimes, though, when I dream of taking on the head of Rachel, it's not a good dream. Rachel's head beside mine just turns away from me, refuses me. And the pain of my longing for her and her refusal of me twists my body into a grotesque grimace of the human form, and all I can do is a sad and stumbling two-step in some bar where the sawdust on the floor rises with my every graceless step into clouds that could be the edges of storm fronts moving in to lay everything to waste. Dreams can leave us in places as bad as any the world can ever take us to. Gloria is looking particularly fine, and the way that waitress get-up announces every curve of her ample body is almost enough to send me out to hunt snakes in the woods. But it's too dark already to have any real shot of finding the snake with my sins on it. Dark enough, who knows what I might find. The other evening, when it was still much lighter than this, I stumbled over an exposed root, and my hand reached out and clutched the trunk of a fir to break my fall. And I felt what turned out to be words in Spanish, carved into the tree. Though shallow now, when they were first carved into the tree, they must have been carved deep. Only part of the sentence remained, and I only recognized a few of the Spanish words. But I had heard of the man who had long ago carved his signature under that almost gone sentence. Hernando de Soto was the name scrawled under that sentence I believe spoke of his longing for gold and his despair over how it eluded him. Too often what we ask of the world goes unanswered, though maybe the odds get better when what we desire of the world is help in repenting. Maybe the longings of the spirit are what the earth most wants to satisfy. Like to think that could be so, that in time the earth will send up the scarlet snake with my sins etched on its skin, so I can be saved and made whole again, so that the ghost of a woman's perfect face will cease to haunt me. Some nights I stay in the woods till dawn. On clear nights the stars reflect in the calm water of Lake Kanasaga with such accuracy, it's almost as if there's another world in this one. A better world, maybe, I think, on such nights. A world where a gator doesn't swallow up a woman and carry her face inside as if it were holy. Where a sister doesn't have to hunker on a stage, pressing the severed hips and legs of her brother to her chest. And where a preacher doesn't have to hold in his hands, filthy with the innards of a gator, the bodiless head of a woman he loved in sin. On such nights, sin almost falls away from me, and off in the distant, dimly lit dark, I imagine a naked woman humming hymns she'd played the hell out of on church organs. I picture Rachel headed in my direction, and as she gets closer, the music she hums changes, grows more fervent, almost as though the music she makes with her lips and her tongue and the depths of her throat is a kind of Geiger counter, ticking more and more rapidly as she nears the man who loves her beyond all faith. It's my body she's seeking those nights, and sin has no hold on any man or woman alive in a garden with two identical skies. One night, lying beside Kanasaga, listening to the muskellunge now and then leap from the lake's calm surface and fall back to the black water, sending ripples through the second sky, so that its moon seemed to shiver with some forbidden passion. I thought of Carl and his Greek-speaking second head, and wondered which head Rachel would have kissed more if she'd ever made love to Carl. Almost asleep, I pictured Rachel moving atop Carl the way she had moved over me so many times. And then Rachel was kissing the woman's head, and the woman's head whispered something into Rachel's mouth. Asleep and dreaming, what the woman's head on Carl's left shoulder was saying was louder and more insistent, and it wasn't Greek at all, ancient or modern. Rachel, she whispered. Love me, Rachel, she said, and gently bit Rachel's lower lip. And Rachel's body and Carl's body blurred and became one body, and it was Rachel's head on Carl's shoulder, and the two heads were kissing, and Carl's body stopped below the ribs, ending in a jaggedness of flesh and bone, and someone was whimpering off in the darkness of some rotted out stage, and it was me. Though it was hard to make him understand about the snakes, how I'd come to believe our sins are written in colors and patterns along their bodies, Carl gets how difficult it is to find the one snake with my sins inscribed on its skin. Think of all the sinning that goes on every night and every day in this fallen world, I've told him. If all sin is recorded on the skins of scarlet snakes, imagine the odds of coming across the one snake in all the world with your sins written across its legless body. How unlikely salvation is, Carl gets more than most. Faith takes each of us on a different journey, he has said to me before, and gives each of us different burdens, I added. Both Carl's heads, it seemed, nodded at that. Tonight, Gloria's whole body seems to lean towards the earth, and her smile is a sort of pained thing that doesn't fit her face. Makes me think that if I were to slip her uniform off, I'd find bruises on her body, and the bruises would form arcane symbols on her flesh. Runes that, if chanted correctly into the night air beside a lake high enough up a mountain that the moon in the sky and the moon in the lake could converse, would be both a prayer for strength and a blessing of tenderness. What I don't want to think I'd find beneath that waitress getup is scales instead of skin. Scales whose colors spell out my sins with such clarity they could never be forgiven. Carl's Greek-speaking woman's head, quiet most of the evening, is all of a sudden ranting. Someone must have watered down the ouzo, Carl says. As his tormentor spews what sounds like a barrage of curses in ancient Greek, Carl tells me when she's like this, he gets to where he believes he could kill her. Right now, Carl says, I'd like to take a knife and shove it in her mouth and push it up till it pokes out the top of her skull. I'd like to skewer her, Carl says. What stops him is what always stops him. Not being sure what killing her would mean for him. If all it would mean, he's told me, is that I'd have to lug a dead woman's head around me with me the rest of my life, I'd do it in a minute. Hell, maybe they could even cut her off once she's dead. Would they throw me in jail? Would it be murder? Carl has asked me more than once. Or would they charge me with attempted suicide? What scares Carl the most is that killing the woman's head that drunkenly rants in Greek most nights into his left ear might be the death of him, too. Just how much a part of me is she, Carl has said. She's gone quiet again, and he glances at her without turning his head. Gloria brings Carl and me another round and another ouzo. Carl's drinking Stroh's, and I wonder what kind of hangover he might have in the morning. Folks say mixing different types of alcohol is a prescription for a major hangover, and since Carl and the ouzo drinking woman's head share one body, it seems a bad idea for Carl to be downing beers. Carl, maybe you should drink whiskey or vodka, something more akin to ouzo is my point. I'll be damned if I'm going to let her determine what I drink. The way he says this, it's clear how much he's already taken from him. Sent away is the more accurate term for it, Carl has said. My wife and son, my siblings, almost all my friends, he said, giving me a little smile. Seems that though he's had this woman's head on his shoulder all his life, it wasn't until she started speaking that he started losing everything that mattered to him. Carl's told me she'd been mute most of his life. Then, Carl said, when we were baptizing our son, right there in church, she started into speaking what turned out, according to the priest, to be ancient Greek. He said he recognized a word here and there. No one could ignore her after that. She was quiet the night he told me this, just a little muttering under her ouzo's sweet stinking breath. Occasionally what I'd call a whimper. Can't even work no more, Carl said. Said his boss told him that since she started talking, having him around made everyone else in the shop nervous. Disability pay is what I live on now. Only one hooker will even deign to service me, Carl said, and she makes me pay double. I laughed at that, but stopped when I saw the look on Carl's face. Hell, even his tormentor's face gave me a look that told me how offended she was. She muttered something in that arcane Greek of hers and swallowed more ouzo. Miracles do happen, Carl. I mean to offer him some semblance of hope that he might one day be free of his foreign tormentor. But Carl takes what I say differently. You might call this a miracle, he says with a nod to the left of his head, but she ain't no miracle. This here's a damnation, is what she is. Some sort of demon, Carl says. Not even hell wanted her, so I got stuck with her. I gave up long ago trying to figure out what sin I'd committed, Carl says, to justify this. Must have been so awful I've blocked it out. Repress the memory of whatever I did to earn this vexation is what I've done, Carl says. If you come across a snake out in the woods, having trouble crawling for the weight of the sins inscribed in its scales, he says, that's the one with my sins on it. Carl not only knows of my searching, he knows I used to be a preacher and that I worked with faith healers back in the day. Too bad that gator ate that boy healer, he said once. Sounds like maybe he could have freed me of her. Maybe he could have spoken to her in what used to be called tongues and convinced her to go back to hell. Don't know if that Phineas could have helped me none, though, Carl said. Hell, I'd be afraid what might happen if she were to swallow one of his worms. I didn't bother to remind him it was Phineas who swallowed the worms, not those in need of healing. Phineas and the boy and all the rest are gone now, so it's not like it mattered he was confused as to what they did. None of them are doing anything no more. And all I'm doing is trying to find a snake with my sins on it to cut up and fry with some onions and peppers so I can eat it and be set free from the ghost of a woman's face that haunts me every bit as much as Carl's second head haunts him. That head humming something that sounds very old and very sad in Carl's left ear. Humming don't seem to work for me like it worked for Jebediah. Every afternoon I head out into one of the pine forests. Some I can hike to, and others I have to drive to, they're so far off. The Chattahoochee National Park covers some ground. I make sure the sun is almost ready to drop down out of sight before I start into humming. And the tune I hum is the closest I can recall to what Jebediah used to hum when he was out gathering snakes. Jebediah's music brought snakes out of the earth every time. Must be I have the tune wrong. My ear for music was never all that exact, though when Rachel played a church organ, I'd swear every note echoed in my body for days. Gloria's humming as she brings Carl and his tormentor and me another round. It's no hymn she's humming. What's that tune? Carl says. His tormentor has started whistling what Gloria's humming. What? Was I humming? Gloria says and smiles, and goes back to her humming with a look on her face like she's listening to herself to try to name that tune. Not one of us can say what tune it is, but it's catchy, that's for sure. Not only is Carl's tormentor whistling it in his left ear, Carl and I start into humming it too. Pretty soon, all four of us are going at it like it's some symphony we're performing, each of us taking a different pitch. Several of the other Marlowe's regulars join in, and soon just about everyone drinking in this dive is humming this tune not one of us can name. Jimmy, over at the bar, is using his unwashed beer glasses as percussion, and Gloria is dancing with the music we're all making. This music she started without knowing she was humming. Seems everyone in this bar was waiting for something to call them out of themselves, to get them to celebrate just being here, and having had enough to drink to make a song no one recognizes infectious enough to pull us all into it. Carl just kissed his tormentor. It's all something to see. I want to remember this tune and take it with me into the woods. Maybe this is the music that will bring out my snake and let me kiss the ghost of Rachel's face the last time before letting it go. Gloria is looking at me with her arms out. In the uncertain light of this place, she looks enough like forgiveness to get me up and moving in front of all these humming fools in this place of faith they call Subligna. Could be I've still got some dancing left in me.
Thank you, George. And congratulations on the publication of The
Oh.
Invisibility of Things Long Submerged.
Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, no, it's such a pleasure to hear you read that. And we've known each other through the writing world for some time now, and I've always associated you with Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And here comes this manuscript that is just absolutely steeped in this Southern Gothic flavor. And so, it makes me wonder, maybe you have a Southern background that I wasn't aware of. That wouldn't be surprising. Or where did the Southern stuff come from?
Well, actually, I guess at least a couple of different sources. I think part of it is from stories that I heard when I was young, very young. My relatives lived in Lexington, Kentucky, and every summer my family would go down there, and we would spend a lot of the summer on different farms down in Kentucky. So I think some of it comes from that. I grew up in Cincinnati, which, according to some people at least, is a southern city, really, or at least used to be. I hear that it's kind of gone downhill at this point, but anyway, shouldn't have said that in recording, whatever. But probably the greatest sort of influence, I think, on this book is the writer William Goyen. In fact, the epigraph of the book is from his novel Arcadio, basically his last novel. That actually it was accepted before he died, but it was published shortly after he actually died. And he was a writer that I didn't get introduced to until graduate school. And once I was introduced to him, I started reading everything I could get my hands on. I've now read everything that he ever published. And I bet that if you go to any English, program in the country and ask, do you know the work of William Goyen? Probably, most people will say, who? He is actually considered in Europe as one of the greatest writers of the 20th century, American writers of the 20th century, but he's not so well known in this country. But the absolute beauty of his music, and he's a South Texas writer, and just the lyric quality of his prose has always fascinated me. And it's not like I was trying to write like William Goyen, because William Goyen is unique. Nobody else will ever write like he did. But I think that that kind of voice kind of fed into these stories.
And just so we for those not familiar with his work, what would be a good place to start for William Goyen for people looking to read more about?
Well, there was I think this was actually also a posthumous thing, a collection of new and selected stories called Had I 100 Mouths? And it's the new and selected stories of Goyen. That would be a good place to start. His first novel, House of Breath, which was, I think, published in 1950, maybe, was a huge critical success, not a popular success. It was a very innovative novel. But yeah, Had I 100 Mouths. And I would also recommend Arcadia, which was his last novel. Joyce Carol Oates said that, especially in that book, his prose was more like song than it was prose. She was a big admirer of William Goyen's work.
Yeah, excellent.
And Doris Roberts, who played the mother on Everybody Loves Raymond.
Oh yeah.
That was his wife. He met her when she was performing in one of his plays on off Broadway, and we did a friend of mine and I, who unfortunately is no longer with us. We did a special issue of Mid-American Review a long time ago on Goyen's work, and we actually got an interview with her, and so we got the last thing that William Goyen ever wrote. At the end, he was in the hospital. He had been operated on. He could not talk, so he was like writing things down on a yellow legal pad. And the last thing he actually wrote was, "It takes two robins to make a spring, and you only give me one."
Oh, that's great. That's excellent. And so I should know, since you bring it up, and I think you're still with Mid-American Review, but if you're not, I know you've spent a long time. Are you still working with them?
I am the translation editor of
Okay.
Mid-American Review still, yes.
Yeah, so for those who don't know, George has been worked with Mid-American Review and for Mid-American Review and all sorts of things for many years, and it's one of our finest journals that we have in this country, one of my favorite literary journals. And geez, how long has Mid-American Review been around for? It's got to be a
Oh God, I don't even. Geez, I think they're on volume 30 something at this point.
wow.
And the translation chapbook series, which I actually started when I was a graduate student there, is still going. And that's where we do actually a whole like collection of work, and we also put the original language along with the English translation, and I don't know what they're up to now, but it's because they do one every issue. So I think they're around like probably 50 something or something like that.
Yeah, that's excellent and so unique and necessary. You don't see that. You don't see translations too often, and certainly not that sort of commitment to translation.
Right.
So one word that comes to me a lot when I think about your book is faith. It's absolutely a central theme to the collection, and it takes many different forms. And there, obviously, religion is a big theme throughout, where faith comes into play, but also family and romantic faith and all sorts of different faith. And invariably, it gets broken. Uh, so, can we talk some about where faith comes into play in the collection?
Well, I think that that's probably connected to the fact that I'm a writer, and writing itself is a kind of no matter how sort of full of despair the writing might be, the act of writing itself is an optimistic act. It's to suggest that somebody's going to read it, that there is a future, shall we say. And so I've always felt like religion has always been, I mean, I grew up, at one point I was actually being trained to enter the ministry of the Episcopal, I was going to say priesthood, but they were then Catholic, and I was Catholic light, I was Episcopalian. I always liked, in fact, that I belonged to a church that only existed because the king wanted to divorce his wife and the Pope said no. And so he said, to hell with you, I'll make my own church. And then he made one of the bishops of the Catholic Church his Pope. So I thought that was kind of interesting too. But at one time I was going to actually enter the priesthood. But over the course of my life, some of that has changed. But even if religion hasn't always been, like as important to me as it was when I was younger, perhaps, faith always has been. And I like to think, even though, as you say, that gets broken a lot in various ways, the last story in the collection does end, though, with that line of, I can't know, in fact, I'll actually quote myself here. Yeah. Thank the Lord that Cain or no Cain, this breath is enough to say, I love you. Praise the Lord that after everything else, there can still and always be love. And that's where the book ends.
Yes, and there's a lot of enduring, through that. So I think a lot of these characters just are beaten down in many ways, but there is that sort of sense of coming back and overcoming some different things. And yeah, there's a optimism that runs through it. You're right. As much as there's a bleakness and all that stuff, a hauntingness to it, there is also a hopefulness that runs through it. The other thing that you do in this book that is brave is, writing sex scenes are notoriously difficult and can go horribly awry in different ways. And you have some different, scenes in this book with sexual content in them. And I'm curious, did you sort of develop any strategies for getting into it? Did you, what was it like to write those? Any tips?
Well, I think that what I would say is that the sex scenes, as you refer to them, and the sexuality that runs throughout the book. I almost said novel because I still think of it as a novel in stories. I know it's not, but that's what I was trying to write. So, but they all arise naturally out of the characters and sort of the nature of the characters and the torment that the characters are engaged in and involved in and enveloped by. And so I guess, okay, this is going to sound a little strange, I guess. But something I tell like my undergraduate students here a lot in poetry classes, because I only teach poetry here. But it's like, you need to find ways to allow yourself to listen to what language has to tell you. Because even a language as young as well, I'm going to say American, which I know is a dialect really of English, but as young as the American language, let's say, knows a lot more than you do. It knows, it has more experience, and it knows more. And if you can find ways to listen to what language can tell you, then you're going to end up writing things that you could not have in any way imagined yourself writing before you actually wrote it. I think that's one of the things that happened with a lot of those scenes that you're referring to.
Yeah, and that, it makes me think of your approach to language as making it sensible to move between genres like you do. And that's something I think that we both share as writers, a love of moving between genres and sort of not paying much attention to them in some ways. And I think, looking at language and looking at words, I always say to people, it's just words. I can use them however I want. Right. So, but I think that's an even deeper way of looking at it when you get it down to the word level, even beyond language.
Yeah. And I think that, something else I'm always harping on with my students is the sentence. So often we forget that the sentence is the basis of everything. And in poetry, it still is. The only difference, for at least for me in poetry, is that in poetry you have both the sentence, but you also have the line. And you have the various ways that the line can work against or work with the sentence. And so you have to read the poem syntactically and linearly. And I really do feel like that over many years, I don't even want to say how many at this point, of writing poems has made me perhaps more aware of the sentence and the music of it. And I'd like to think, personally, I think this is my best writing in prose, this particular book. And I'm really glad that it's been published by a really good press. Because I really do feel like I'm never going to write anything as good in prose as what's in this book.
Well, it's absolutely haunting. And I will say that there are characters in here that just stick with you and are really just on multiple, I don't want to call them creepy, but I mean, there's a lot of creepy elements to a lot of the characters. And there is also hope and all those things like that. But I'm curious, because there are some really intense and creepy characters and scenes and so forth. Did you start with something like that? Was there one character? I mean, you've described this as almost a novel in stories, and we could certainly make that argument. It could go either way. A lot of times those works do come from wanting to chase down one character's story, and then everything develops out of it. Was that the case with this? Was there a character or two that?
Well, in fact, what happened was this all started. Okay, this would have been 96, I believe, 1996. I was in a bar in Bowling Green, Ohio. We were waiting for a pool table. And so I was having some drinks with some fiction graduate students. And we were having a discussion, and I honestly don't remember what this discussion was completely about. But at some point in the discussion, somebody, and I think it was me, but I don't want to say for sure. Tasha, if you're out there, you can tell me if I'm wrong about this. But somebody said, Jesus is a shell game. And there were three of us there when this happened. We all decided somebody should write a story with that as the title. And so it was like a challenge. We were all going to write this story, sort of like, the Frankenstein story, right? We were all going to write it. I was the only one that actually followed through. Of course, we were all drinking, so they may not. I always in those days I kept a little notepad in my pocket, and I would write things down, and I actually took it out and wrote that down. The original title of the first story, What Gives Us Voice, was Jesus is a Shell Game. And the idea was these three voices were like the three shells, and that the P, the truth, was somewhere in there, but it wasn't really in there because it had been palmed. And so, that's what I was playing with as the structure of the story. Once I wrote that story, though, I realized I gotta keep working with these characters and this world that has been created in the story. And virtually every other story in the book came out of mining that story. There were two stories that I wrote, originally not for this book, but then I realized after I'd written them that and then I reworked them to fit into this book. But most of the book came out of just writing that one story and not wanting to let go of it yet.
And it really is such a complete world. I mean, I love that, it really is. It's just one of these books where when you open it, you do enter into that world. And I feel like by the end, you've really felt around all the edges of it and the people in it and the settings and so forth. So it feels very complete and very finished. And I just think it's a fantastic collection. So I hope people will check it out, The Visibility of Things Long Submerged. And thank you so much for being here. I'm going to ask you, if you wouldn't mind, I know you have a poetry collection coming out in August called The Acrobatic Company of the Invisible. And there's a whole other discussion there about having two books with visibility in the title. We'll revisit that another time. But if you would be willing to share a poem from that collection as we leave, we'd be really grateful for that. And thank you for being here, George.
Well, thank you, Peter. And this is a very short poem from that book, which actually won the Cider Press Review Editor's Prize. It's coming out in August. And the title of this poem is Soundtrack for Mystery in a Field of Muddy Angels. Cows low miraculous psalms under a callous moon. That's all the light I have in which to see the arches of the faces this music rises out of. Brutish, and yet as graceful as any articulation in paint or plaster of angels. I'm writing to a distant woman. Behind me, inside this house, my wife and her parents are practicing music. A concerto for violin and piano, Mozart put down in a drunken fervor long enough ago. The alcohol is gone, and all that remains is the fervor. Mozart must have felt the sort of ache the woman I write to is. The devout lowing of cows in the field across the road seems a proper accompaniment to the raw rendition of Mozart starting up inside the lit up house I will have to go back into soon. What each of us carries inside us is too awful to be articulated by something as divine as even the most inept music.
Wow. Thank you so much, George. That was a wonderful reading. Thank you for sharing it with us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.
And Peter, thank you so much as always for a wonderful conversation. And finally telling it all together, thank you all for attending tonight and joining us. If you're interested in any of George's books, I did put a link to one of them in our chat. You can find more of them at ampersandbooks.org. And other than that, have a great night and thanks again for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.